All right, church. All right. I've learned with my voice never to start off full bore. Always start really quiet, and John appreciates that, I know. But thank you for coming here. We're going to do a covenant Q&A, and typically what I like to do, if it's okay, is there have been some questions that have been submitted to me ahead of time, so I'm going to go ahead and address those first. And maybe you'll find that some of the questions will spur more questions with you, or maybe answer some questions that you might have already thought about. And I recognize that this is a new process for everybody. This is the umpteenth time I've done this, but it's the first time that you've ever done this. And so this is the first church covenant with Indiana Ministries you've ever read. And so all questions are fair game. There's no stupid questions. Feel free to ask. And at the end of when I get through the questions that were submitted, we'll open up the floor for any other questions you might have. And staff, feel free to ask questions as well, because you're included, Fred and John, in this covenant. And Fred and I talked after the service, and absolutely I want to encourage any staff that's here. If you've got any questions, you can feel free to ask it, and I'll do my best to answer. All right, let's get started. It says, question number 1, the covenant states that IM will provide and cover the cost of the coach for 3 years of the covenant. Where does the coach come from? And will he or she be a regular part of our congregation during the covenant period? I will be the coach to your next pastor. I do a majority of the coaching. Well, right now I do all of the coaching for our covenant churches for Indiana Ministries. There's the only exceptions to that were we had a covenant church plant, kind of a mission outpost for us in Auckland, New Zealand. And I went there and did a consultation with the church in Auckland, but I wanted to make sure that if they're going to plant a church, that we got a pastor that knows about church planting to do the coaching. So that was an exception. There also might be a time that your pastor and board might need a specific coach that I feel that I'm not best qualified to do. So maybe for 6 months or a year, and it's the exception to the rule, but it's certainly not unheard of that I might step aside and we'll pay for another coach to come in to do some specific guidance for the board and the staff to do that. But no, they will not be a regular part of your congregation during the coaching period. If they lived in the Vincennes, that would be nice, but typically we've never had that luxury. But if I do it, it'll be the rare exception that I've actually been part of this church for a while. And I think at the end of the year, it'll be somewhere around 9 months. And so I'm getting to know you, and you're getting to know me. So I think that's an advantage. And that's never happened before, where we've had this kind of involvement with a church prior to a covenant vote. Question 2. We've been in agreement with IM, or have we been in agreement with Indiana Ministries and simply renewing the covenant period, as I guess I'm assuming as I've been here as transitional pastor, or is this brand new to us? If we have already been in covenant with IM, then are we financially supporting them at 5% at this point already? Well, the answer to that is the church has been a long-time supporter of IM under Dr. Carl's leadership. So your support is nothing new to state ministry. Always been faithful in that area. But you're considering being in covenant with IM. You're not today. And I apologize if you serve on the board or you know somebody serves on the board and they talk about a covenant that they're going to be considering with Pastor Jeff and the board. When I wrote a transitional pastor agreement, I just termed it a covenant. And so maybe that was some of the confusion. And those covenants run 3 months. So we're tied to each other for a period of 3 months, but if something comes up in my life or in the church's life that you feel needs to make a change, we're only stuck with each other for 3 months. And so far, we like being stuck with each other. And we've just agreed, I think, in October's meeting or in September's meeting to extend out for October, November, December. So those are termed like transitional pastor covenants. And that's an agreement that your board has through me with Indiana Ministries, where they pay Indiana Ministries for my services. This is not adding to my W-2. This is something I'm doing as part of my job with Indiana Ministries. First time I've ever done this, like we said during the consultation weekend, I've never filled in as a transition pastor for a church that's considering covenant that's having a pastoral change. But the board and myself, we just sensed the Lord's hand in doing this after we tried for months and months to try to figure out, because we've been working on trying to find y'all a transitional pastor since we knew Pastor George was leaving. So it was way pre-COVID, and it was just amazing how we were striking out. But, you know, the Lord always knows, I hope, what he's doing, at least on my end. It has really been a blessing to be with you all. So that might be a little confusion there, because if you're tied to the board or you're on the board, you hear covenant there, and then you're hearing the church vote on covenants. You're wondering what's the difference. So the covenant you're voting on is totally different. That's a partnership with Indiana Ministries. The other one with the board is just for me to bridge the gap as a transitional pastor for y'all during this time, and each of those are for a period of 3 months. And I just want to give you a little bit of context on the history of what that 5% level of support is. Please don't think of it as a fee that Indiana Ministries is charging you for a service that we're providing. When State Ministry was formed, I don't know how many years ago, I was either a young pup or not even born yet, but whenever Indiana Ministries came into existence, along with other regional pastor ministries like in Ohio and Michigan, Florida, Kentucky, local churches said, we need help resourcing. We need somebody to help us organize and license and credential our pastors. We need an organization to come to help equip us as pastors and local congregations to be able to better effectively pursue the mission of making more and better disciples. So what they decided to do was to form well, I'll just put it in our context of our state. Indiana Ministries was formed, our state ministry, and we report to local pastors and churches. As a matter of fact, tomorrow we're having our annual meeting, and every pastor that registers comes, they vote on the budget, they vote on the slate of officers, they approved Doug Talley back in the day to be the executive state pastor. Doug presents them goals, what he hopes to accomplish, casts some vision. We do some equipping during that time, but we're responsible to local congregations, the lay delegates they send to tomorrow's meeting, plus the pastors. They make up our General Assembly. And we have our own bylaws, we have our own board of directors that are made up of lay leaders in the state and pastors in the state. But back when Indiana Ministries was formed and all state ministries was formed, the guidance to local churches is when they did that, they said, we're going to, in our part of our tithe, we're going to give half of it, or 5%, to support state work. And it was that way when I entered the ministry in the early 90s. Back when I was making $200 a week, the church was given 5% to national, 5% to the state. And in the Church of God, if you're not familiar with us, we're congregational. We're very independent. Like Indiana Ministries does not fall under Jim Lyon and the National Church of God Ministries in Anderson. Sometimes they get calls that are meant to go for us, or we get calls that are meant to go for them. We're our own 501c3. They're their own. We work together as best we can, but, you know, we don't have performance reviews down the road to Anderson. And each state ministry is just like that as well. The Church of God is really interesting that way, how independent it is. And every congregation votes on their own budget. You call your pastor, they stay for as long as works out for the church. You don't have a bishop like Doug Talley saying, okay, it's been 5 years, time to make a change, or I want to pull that person, and you just don't have that. So there's some benefits to that as well. But that's where that 5% support level came, and it's just trying to get the church back to a healthier level of support. But don't think that, like, say when the covenant ends, we really have to coach boards and churches because they say, oh, the covenant's over, thank you very much. Now we can just free that money up for something else. And where they used to say, maybe they gave 3.5% or 4% to state ministry, then all of a sudden that drops to zero. And I just don't want that to happen with Vincennes. Whenever I hope and pray this covenant's successful, we're going to partner. But when it comes to an end, don't think, well, that's a bill then. I can tell our treasurer not to pay. You got to figure out the level of support the Lord's leading the board to give. But that's where that 5% comes from. Question 3. If the senior pastor resigns during the covenant period, how significant is the role IM will play in selecting a new pastor? Will we as a congregation have input in that decision? It would be the same as the process that is leading up to your vote next week. If you vote to become a covenant church, Indiana Ministries will act as your board and search team's headhunter firm. So we go beat the bushes and we make the initial calls. And we also are going to consider people that you bring to us to say, hey, here's somebody that we'd like you to consider. And I think all of those things are going to come into play here in Vincennes. I know they are. But if you lose a pastor within the 3 years, I hope you don't, unless, seriously, lightning strikes him or her or something. But if they come in for a year and a half and say, I'm out, there's a problem either with them or the church. I don't foresee it happening. But if it does, Indiana Ministries will work. We'll use the same pastor profile that you helped us develop that's in the covenant, and we will hit the ground running and find that next pastor. As a matter of fact, I was sharing with Keith, because you got me and I talk a lot, I'll tell you, I think appropriately, some information on the senior pastor search. We are not doing a hard stop on any calling, any context for good pastoral leadership. We've got other churches that are covenant, that are in search of senior pastors, so we're casting the nets. But as we're doing that and we're saying, hey, we got this church in Vincennes, we've got a couple that seem to have real potential. We haven't assessed them yet, but so far, each step, this step before we get to assessing them and doing the tools that we put upon them to see how well do they fit the profile, resume-wise, recommendation-wise, they look promising to this point. So we've really got 3, I think. Well, 2 of them, let me tell you, all 3 are saying of all the churches that you have, Vincennes is the one I want to focus in on. So we're already to the, we're fishing, but we got to be appropriate. And here's what happens when we find a candidate. If we find 3 candidates, your search team will interview all 3. If we find 2 that meet the criteria, now they got to want to be here too. That's going to be a key criteria, and say this culture fits me, the climate fits me. By the way, of all the churches we're looking for, you got the best climate of all of them. There's a big difference. There's a couple degrees difference between, well, it's raining in Indy now. It's not raining here. The weather's a lot nicer. There's some people, and there's one that's in Illinois that thinks, you know what, coming across the river is a good idea. And that's his number one. There's one that is in Oklahoma who has family that lives around Vincennes. So the Lord's at work. I just tell you that to just tell you. And there's also one that we're also going to bring into the fold. We're excited to consider that one. So we really got 3 so far. But we'll see. At the end of the process, we might have 0. But I think it's encouraging that the Lord is and that's the way the walk with the Lord is, isn't it? You keep walking, you keep encouraging the congregation to just, you point to God, not to Indiana Ministries. I'll point to your board because you got some good folks on your board, but we're all trusting the Lord in this. And all of a sudden, the way God works, things just break open. And then you look back and you say, that's the reason, and you can look back and God allows you to connect the dots a little bit. But that's the senior pastor process. It will follow your bylaws procedure where the search team will get 1, 2, 3, however many candidates that we think are strong candidates for them to consider fit the pastor profile. They have a desire to have the conversation with the search team in Vincennes. They will get to know the candidate. They will pray. Maybe they'll bring 2 back and eliminate 1, and they'll find their recommended candidate. They'll be in conversation with us to say, what do you think? I mean, we're here for them. But they'll make that recommendation according to your bylaws. They'll decide, and then they will forward that recommendation to the church, and they will structure a candidate weekend or a get-to-know-you weekend where you'll bring in the whole family, the spouse, if there's kids. You'll get a chance to show them around Vincennes. They will get a chance to interact with the staff, meet the board, spend some time with the board. There'll be structured things where they can get to know you as a congregation and ministry leaders. And then that weekend, typically, they'll preach on Sunday, and then you'll have all that in, and you'll have a vote. And you'll vote them up or down based on the criteria of your bylaws. Does that make sense? So all Indiana Ministries is doing is kind of culling the herd so that the search team can focus in on some serious candidates, because a lot of times they're going through resumes and making phone calls and next. This really, and not only that, but the contacts and the relationships. I'm just amazed at what Doug has, and I'm learning as I go. I've only been in this thing 10 years, but I'm already learning relationally who's who and who does what and who to call, and the Lord has been opening up some key doors for that. Question 4. I'm a little concerned about the extra time commitment expected of the senior pastor in the covenant, participating in all workshops, and you caught that word, all, and that's in the covenant seminars sponsored by IM, and also spending 20-25% of his or her time in a community, reporting to the coach monthly. That sounds really time-consuming. Number 1, being a senior pastor at church is time-consuming, but this particular piece of the covenant is not something that your senior pastor is going to find burdensome. Let me address each of those individually. The workshops that we offer from Indiana Ministries, every year we offer 2, maybe 3 opportunities. Like the annual meeting is a time for pastors to get equipped, challenged, poured into. We've got a guy coming that because of all the plates I'm spinning, I apologize, I don't know really well, but he's supposed to be just an impactful guy. We spend money to bring him in. We encourage your covenant pastor, your new pastor, to go to Indianapolis, participate in our annual meeting, network, get to meet people, get equipped by the featured speaker, things like that. It used to be every year. I think we missed this year during COVID, but a lot of times we'll have a marriage retreat for pastors where pastors and their spouses come, and we provide a hotel in Indianapolis area, food, a marriage and family expert to come in and just minister to couples, because being in ministry is tough. If you're a covenant pastor, we pay for you to be there. We pay your hotel. We pay your date money. We treat you well. If we bring in somebody else, like we're bringing in Carl Vaders, it was delayed because of COVID. It's going to be rescheduled for, cross our fingers as this thing keeps dragging out, but it was spring of 2021. And Carl Vader, if you probably don't know him, but if you're a pastor or you read Christianity Today or any pastor bloggers, he's one of the preeminent guys that focuses specifically on small churches of your size and smaller. And how do you lead a church? How do you turn a church like that around? Because so many times you go to conferences and you're at a Willow Creek or you're at a Saddleback, and What's that have to do with Vincennes? You're 20,000. We're below 500. How does that translate to us? Well, Carl Vader specifically believes that God does some of his best work in smaller churches. And we had him on the docket. Well, your pastor will get to go to that at no cost, where we would charge other people to do that. And I'll tell you what, every time they do, if we don't provide lunch, I make sure I take all our covenant pastors and anybody that went with them to their church, and I take them out to lunch. Or if it's an overnight, I take them to a restaurant, and Indiana Ministries just treats them well to do that. Spending time in your community, you're going to want your pastor outside the church office. Being present in the church building is good to a point, but you don't want your pastor being just 100% of his time meeting people, dealing with people in the church, and doing biblical exegesis. Those things are great, but lost people are never going to find their way to his office. And building community connections will never happen if he or she stays here in the building. You need to have them get out so they can build relationships with the people that serve them coffee and donuts. We pastors love donuts and coffee. And from the people that serve their coffee and donuts to people in City Hall, to the people in the fire station, to the people in the police station, to school boards, to their neighbors. They need to get out and build relationships and model what we're hoping that pastor will challenge this church and equip the church to get out, to be the hands and feet of Christ, to be salt and light in this community so that we're outward focused. So many times, you'll see that word outward focused in the covenant, but so many times churches view that as, well, that's what Pastor Fred does, and we're so glad. He does church on the street. We've got some volunteers, and they do that. We're outward focused. Or they'll say, well, we got Faith Promise coming up, which you do, and good stuff happening there, and we sacrifice and we give, and we make time on our calendar to make sure that happens, and we support Isaiah 117, and we do this and that, and we're outward focused. But that doesn't get us away from the responsibility that we have to be bearers of the mission, to be missionaries outside the walls of this church. So that's really what I want you to think about when you hear that term, outward focused. Because if it was not just, but if being outward focused was 100% about church on the street and Faith Promise and supporting missions, you guys would get an A+. But that's not going to win the people that you're rubbing shoulders with every day. That's not going to bridge those folks to Jesus Christ. So you're going to want your pastor to do that, and I think any pastor that fits the profile is going to be excited to do this. As a matter of fact, I was just in a conversation with a pastor from a southern state that was interested in a little further north, a church that was further north, and it's a covenant church. It's in Decatur, Indiana, and they're looking for a pastor. And he got so excited after reading the covenant, he called his state pastor in Kentucky and says, why aren't we doing this? All our churches need this. And he said, this is so great. And I want you to know that pastors that fit the profile will look at this partnership and they'll say, holy cow, this is great. You mean the church I'm considering going to has already given permission to make changes and pursue the covenant and pursue the mission? That's terrific. I'm allowed outside my office 20-25% of the time. Nobody, because they're coming from churches that if they don't see the pastor's car in the parking lot, he ain't working. It doesn't matter. Or if they see him parked in the Starbucks, you know that stinker. Look at every time he's at the Starbucks, or he's over here, or he's never in his office. It just doesn't count for them in their churches if they're building relationships with people far away from God. You do that on your time, pastor, not on our time. And there's some truth to that, but it should be your time as well to enable him or her to go and model exactly what we're asking, because that's kingdom work, that's ministry. And you're saying that's important by that. Next question, are the guiding principles to be developed by the Board of Elders only, or will the senior pastor and congregation have any input? The guiding principles are developed in conjunction with the senior pastor and the board. They are a working document that each promise to abide by. So the guiding principles are your board saying, Pastor, you have our permission in advance to lead our church the way you see fit, as long as you stay within these parameters on behavior, on finances, on ethics, those kind of things. And you've got to submit goals from you and your staff rolled up to you where you own them. So if I'm senior pastor, John submits goals, Fred submits goals. They become my goals. I negotiate it with them, and I make sure that I'm happy with it. Then I roll them up, and I own them to the board and say, board, here's the ministry goals of this church. And we negotiate it out, and once they're happy, I'm happy, we sign off on them, and then I give them progress measures on how we're doing throughout the year. That's a key part of the guiding principles that happens. It also makes sure that your pastor behaves biblically, morally, and ethically, legally. It tells me how much I could spend. It tells me I can't spend things that aren't budgeted. It tells me I maybe can or can't do this much of indebtedness without going to the board, that kind of thing. But it's a working document. It's nothing that the congregation votes on and debates, because it's something that clearly states what the role of the pastor is, the role of the board. There's also a piece in there that tells the board what the mission of the church is and what their role is as a board, holding the pastor accountable. That they have one employee, that employee is a senior pastor. They don't triangulate with John or Fred. They deal with the pastor. Now, they can invite John or Fred in if the pastor says, yeah, I think it would be good this time. They could do that. It also reminds the board chair of his role. I'm pointing to Keith, and Keith is probably thinking, short timer, you're going to lose a good board chair, by the way. But it reminds the board chair that if there's any board member that is, say, leaving the board and complaining to the congregation about decisions of the board, that's unethical. You're not supposed to do that. It's the board chair to make sure you keep all the ponies in line. That, if there's any discipline or any reminder that, hey, you know what? You can't really act that way, or you need to show up for meetings, or, whatever it is, it states in those guiding principles that there's accountability principles that the board needs to operate by. But every year, those guiding principles are evaluated between the pastor and the board. How did we do? Pastor, did you follow all the guide? Did you stay within the guardrails? Do we need to adjust it, maybe tighten it up a little bit, loosen it up a little bit? And so that's reviewed, negotiated, and tweaked every single year. So it's kind of a working document, but it's something that if the pastor violates, there's consequences to it. He is accountable to the board for that. Under the elders' covenant, it states that the new bylaws will allow for an outside advisor to be part of the board selected by IM and trained in governance. Where does that selection come from? Well, we find a lot of where our covenant churches that aren't operating under guidance. As a matter of fact, we just did a covenant with Westlake Church of God on the west side of Indy. They had it in their bylaws to do governance. In other words, everything I've just described to you, but they weren't doing it. So the board really didn't know what they were to do. The pastor didn't really know what he was supposed to do, and they were kind of just like drifting. And so it wouldn't surprise me whether they, even though they had governance for a long time, they don't know what to do. Nobody's really equipped them, trained them, but it would help to have a pastor, which is basically what we've done in other covenant churches. We put a pastor as an outside board member, a Church of God pastor who has operated under governance, knows and is comfortable what it's about, to just sit on the board and be an outside voice. And it just helps you to keep on track when it comes to this whole, because it takes you a year, really, to start getting comfortable with, instead of being in the weeds and maintenance over every single detail of the church, how are we supposed to do this? what's this look like? What's a board meeting look like? We'll train you. We'll have training sessions for you and the pastor, but it just helps having somebody there on the ground with you to make sure that you get your questions answered on governance and that you're on the right track. And also, it also helps to have an outside perspective when some new ideas are being presented to the board. And it helps the pastor to say, hey, did you ever try this outreach event? Or did you ever try this training for, I'm going to focus in on marriage and family this year, and here's what I'm thinking. And it just provides just another voice for somebody to say, yeah, I tried that, but here's what you need to be careful. Here's where I slipped up. And if you watch your P's and Q's, I think you'll avoid my mistake. So it's just kind of, it's like that. Think of it as an advisor role. And we've never had a problem where somebody's an outside board member that's been disruptive or wasn't welcomed by the board, but it's just a different way to think. And some churches that are never covenant churches, like say my old church at Madison Park, they have 2 outside board members that are on their board at all times. From pastors from different states that fly in. They're not there for every meeting, but there's a minimum number of meetings that the church flies them in, and they give their time to be there. And it's just a way for them to get an outside perspective. And I think it's a good idea to consider. Where are we? I get going and I totally lose my. Okay, let me just go to the next one. I'm on track. Number 7. Under the accountability section, it states that the Board of Directing Elders are accountable to the congregation, and State Pastor Doug Talley are they not accountable to the senior pastor of the church, and who are the Indiana Ministry Board of Directors. This accountability section's on page 7 of your covenant, so if you all, like me, you brought it, and I realize this is something that is standard in all our covenants, but there's sections there that First Church of God covenants on page 6, Senior Pastor covenants, page 7, Board of Directing Elders covenants, and Indiana Ministries covenants, I think, is on page 5. It might be the first one, yeah. And basically what this means is each of these partners says that you can count on us to do what we said we would do in the covenant. Like your board of directors, they function as a primary board. They follow the pastor's leadership as well as hold the pastor accountable for mission accomplishment within the guiding principles yet to be developed. Each person on the board of directing elders will be primarily committed to and represent the overall mission of the church. Individually together, encourage the senior pastor as they follow his or her leadership to be trained, coached, all those things. Yes, your board of directing elders are accountable to the congregation, but this, with the covenant, we've never had to pull the trigger of accountability, but it's just to have Indiana Ministries, if your board needs to be encouraged or pushed or just nudged just a little bit, let's say if a board member is kind of, well, I didn't vote for that covenant, and they're sitting on the board and they're violating this promise that they're supportive. Well, you've got Indiana Ministries talking with the board chair on, yeah, that's something you need to address because they're violating all kinds of ethical guidance when it comes to boards. Because, and this is something I wish somebody would have told me when I was a young pastor, but when I was transitioning a church in Pennsylvania, they were so dysfunctional in Pennsylvania. We would vote on a budget, and then I'd have one of my board members. In Pennsylvania, everything's built on a hill. You're either going up a hill or down a hill. So this church had at a lower level where you could walk in a lower parking lot, but then go upstairs to get to the main level of the sanctuary. I had an elder member at the bottom telling people to vote no on what his board said yes to vote yes on the budget. And he's down there saying, vote no. Hey, by the way, vote no, vote no. And I knew that was wrong on all kinds of levels, but I didn't have a covenant or state ministry or anything to say, yeah, that's unethical, and honestly, that's illegal for a board member. When you leave a meeting, I've always been told, and we had this in business as well, in corporate life, that, yep, we used to say, when we close the doors, you could shed blood in here. In other words, fight it out. Fight for what you believe in, state your case, say why we need to go your way. But then once we make a decision, that door opens, you better own it like it was your idea. There's none of this, well, I didn't agree with that, I didn't vote for that. This just causes all kinds of dysfunction. And same with church boards. But that's where these accountabilities kind of come in, where the senior pastor covenants, the board covenants, it's just our way when we finish this covenant, just to remind everybody that if you're in, here's the expectations. And we're just telling you that we're accountable, and you're accountable, the board's accountable, your senior pastor is accountable, that yes, you can count on each of these parties to do what we've promised to do. If COVID-19 is still active, will that be taken into consideration in the progress measures? Absolutely, it will. And by the way, this church has really responded to the coming back together physically a lot better than in Metro Indy. In Westlake, I think for the Covenant Sunday, I preached that Sunday instead of Doug, but they had a little over 100, and that was in a church that was over 250. So that was the biggest return they've had since they opened up the door. So their return rate's about 50%, 40%. Here, it's a lot better. But absolutely, if COVID is still going on or anything else that happens that's unexpected, absolutely, we'll pivot and we'll turn, and we'll work with the board and the pastor on that. We're to launch a new life cycle, thinking and acting like a church 2 to 3 times its size, and become a multi-cell church. This is in the recommendations with people flow strategy. What's the average time to appropriate or be effective for this transition? Can we move them too fast, or should we move them fast in getting them evolved? Or the different schools of thought? It will probably take a while, as my answer, probably 3 to 5 years to start a new life cycle, because there's a lot to do. It's basically starting from a blank page and saying, okay, what's the most pressing thing that we need to do? And you tackle that and you move on from there. It'll take a while. Although, here's the encouraging thing for Vincennes. In my experience in doing covenants with churches, the greatest progress and the greatest success has always been where we're writing a covenant and the church is in between pastors. The most struggle is when a church has had a pastor that's been there for 10 years and the church has been like this. Number one, it's hard for them to regain a leadership voice, to say, follow me now. And also, it's hard sometimes for us old dogs to learn new tricks. Although I do have a covenant pastor in Greensburg that I'm going to get up in front of everybody tomorrow at the annual meeting, because he's 65 years old, and he says, Jeff, I'm having the best season of my life. He has totally reinvented himself as a leader and a pastor. He's getting up at 5 every morning and hitting his knees. We talk about prayer in this church, and I bragged on you. It's on tape if you want to see it at Westlake. But during the life cycle, I said, in this church in Vincennes, people were actually griping because they couldn't get more than 20 people in their prayer group. And I said, do you have 20? And they're like, they don't even know what that is in Westlake. And you've got a prayer group of warriors. Now, granted, we always want more people praying. But you guys have it going on. But here's the thing. And I'm just going to answer another question that came in about what our success rate is. Somebody really works with a lot of stuff like this, and they said, what's your success rate? Which is a great question. In other words, how good is the process in being able to turn around churches? I'm going to give you the challenging answer, then the encouraging answer, and maybe a little more of an encouraging answer. Here's the truth. Our success rate in turning around covenant churches, now this includes where covenants start with a pastor that's been there 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and then churches that are in between pastors that we get to bring new leadership in, is about 25%. 25% experience a new life cycle and significant growth. The other 75%, what we find is the downward slope stabilizes, and they start bringing in about as many new people as they lose, and the slide stops. Some encouraging news, though. And I was really discouraged. When Doug and I first heard that, and we did a study of our success rate, we were really discouraged. And then we met with a national leader outside the Church of God that specializes in church consultations, and he said, Doug and Jeff, do you realize what the national average is for churches that work with a denomination or an outside consulting to be able to turn them around, and the church actually, like you're going to do next week, formally makes a decision as a church body to start a new life cycle? We said, well, what's that rate? It's 10% success rate. So we're not happy with the 25%, but looking at what other people are doing, I think we're doing all right. But I'll tell you what, our success rate with churches that are in between pastors is far, multiple times greater. For example, as I was just writing this afternoon, I typed in there, it takes 3 to 5 years to really see significant turnaround when a church has been on the downward trajectory for a long time. But as I look at our most recent covenant churches, and God is opening doors for more and more of these to be just like where you are, where the church can bring in some fresh leadership, fresh eyes, fresh vision, new voice to be able to lead the church forward. We have 3 of our most recent churches. One is in New Albany, down across the river from Louisville. One is in Huntington, which is north on 69, just south of Fort Wayne. And one is in Columbia City, north off of 69, a little southwest of Fort Wayne. All 3 of those churches were in significant decline. They all had new pastors that came in under the covenant, and all of them, after the first 3 years of the covenant, are starting a new life cycle, and they're out of the covenant. Where pastors that we inherited, the growth is a lot slower, and it typically takes covenant after covenant after covenant. Some of them have been 3 covenants of 3 years, so 9 years they've been in covenant. They're making progress, but it's just a lot slower, where if you bring in a new pastor, sometimes you think, man, you're graduating already, and we celebrate with it, and it's just kind of a shock. But I can't predict the future with Vincennes, but I'm saying that's the best indicator, I guess, of your future is the past that I'm showing you. So if we get you a great leader that you're excited about, that is God's man or woman, it wouldn't surprise me at all that you'll see this church really start turning around within this covenant period of 3 years. And I don't think it's going to take another year. Like, one of the questions was, if it takes longer than a year, do we still have to pay Indiana Ministries 5%? We already talked about the 5%. I also want to remind you that this covenant is far more involved than just finding the right pastor. It's that partnership, that coaching to set your new pastor off on the right course. I don't think it's going to take 3 years. I really think that you're going to have a new pastor in 2021. Now, God forgive me, I really mean that he understands. I don't mean write it down in the book, but it seems like God is opening door after door, that if he keeps opening these doors with these candidates, and who knows, there might be another one thrown in there, 1 or 2, that I don't see why we can't have a pastor in the first half of 2021. So that would just be within the first 6 months of the covenant, I would think. But we'll see. Don't tell Doug Talley that I said first 6 months, because I really didn't. I'm just saying it wouldn't surprise me. And I wouldn't say that unless I had the evidence of what God's doing leading up. He could drag his heavenly feet a little bit if he wants to, and he has every right to do that. But he's given us some great indications that we're going to have some great folks come into the state that are terrific leaders of local churches. Okay. Question about conditional deeding to Indiana Ministries per Article 11 of the current bylaws. At the end of the article in the bylaws, there's a note that federal law requires the dissolution clause. Where is that found? It's just standard nonprofit law for state and I guess federal, but really you're registered in the state as a nonprofit, but also you have the 501c3 with the federal. But you have to have in your bylaws a plan for dissolution, where if a nonprofit ceases to exist, what happens to the building, your bank accounts, the assets? You just cannot say, you need to say in your bylaws what your plan is. And your bylaws say the plan is that Indiana Ministries is the recipient of those. And it's just something, it has nothing to do with the covenant. And we do suggest that churches do that just to protect the church. And it's the only thing that triggers it if the conditions trigger it. We had a church in southern Indiana near New Albany, but one of those river towns down there across from Louisville, that had a pastor that wasn't licensed or credentialed through us, a Church of God congregation that brought in a pastor, wasn't licensed. So that was the first red mark. You should have your pastor, and it's probably in your bylaws, it should be licensed and credentialed through the Church of God. And this guy wasn't. We got complaints that he was messing around with members of the opposite sex in the church. Their daughters were calling, their kids were calling. We said, okay. We called the board and said, you've got a couple problems. You've got a pastor who's not credentialed by us, and he's violating ethical, biblical, moral issues. And furthermore, we will never credential him, even if he applied. So you need to say goodbye, or else you'll lose your credentialing through us. They were conditionally deeded. And they said, we don't want to fire him. We want to keep him. People be crazy. I don't know why. Then we said, well, if you keep him, you got to worship somewhere else because you're triggering that condition. And they said, okay. Their tie to him was that strong. They left the building and they bought a little storefront or rented a storefront in town. And it just protected the integrity of that church. But those are just rare, weird things. But they do happen. But this is not, some people think, and I haven't heard that in this church, people kind of get fearful and they think Indiana Ministries wants to take our property. We're not in the business of that at all. At all. If churches close, well, absolutely, we'll help, we'll step in, we'll do whatever. We will reinvest that funds. Our board mandates, just so you know, we can't just send Doug on a cruise or Jeff to the mountains with the money. That money, there's a procedure for it. We reimburse Indiana Ministries for maintaining the property, cutting the grass, the realtor fees, the repair fees, whatever it is. And then it's mandated by our board that that money gets put into church planting. So we reinvest it in the kingdom. It doesn't get to pay the light bills for Indiana Ministry and just we live off that stuff. It's not how it happens. But that's a long way to get to answer that question. But it's standard for any nonprofit. You should have it in your bylaws. If you don't, you're really out of order as a nonprofit or a church. How many times? Oh, I already answered that one. Can you provide an example during the course of a covenant partnership when the governing board of a church disagreed with Indiana Ministries in a major way? How was the disagreement resolved? We've never encountered that. That's the truth. We never have encountered that. We've never been asked to abort a covenant, or we went out of a covenant, or we've had a major disagreement with a pastor or a board. That's just, we don't have any experience with that, and I guess, praise God, we don't. Although I basically agree with the recommendations and the covenant agreement, I'm curious as to whether the boilerplate that is used for all churches with whom you work, comments. You'll find there's some commonality in the recommendations for churches, like churches that need to change their bylaws will have a lot of the same verbiage in and the resources mentioned. Churches that need to be outward focused, you'll see some of the same wording used for the senior pastor covenants, the board covenants, the Indiana Ministries covenants. Much of that is the same, going over covenant churches. You also find similar wording when a church is in between pastors, because we've kind of honed that down. And so we'll tailor it for each church, but there'll be a commonality there for those similar experience. Let's see. Here's one that from somebody that has some experience with strategic planning and federal grants, and it's been their experience that the most valuable part of the process results in setting priorities for budgeting and during decision making in the age of dynamic change, and boy, are we in it. How will this covenant allow for unforeseen circumstances like COVID that interfere with achieving goals? Well, a key part of leadership is adapting on the fly to things that you don't foresee. But here's the thing. Indiana Ministries is not there to say, oh, but that covenant, you need to stick with that. This church is led by your board and your pastor, so they're going to determine the priorities, and we will work if we need to adjust, if we need to tweak this, if we need to just put a pause on a recommendation and say, don't really focus in on that and let the house burn. Let's put out that fire. Let's pivot because of what's happened in the community or what's happening nationally or whatever that it was unforeseen, we didn't see coming. So absolutely. I just want to remind everyone that this partnership is just a true partnership. We'll put some money in. We'll definitely put extra attention in on covenant churches. You get a lot more of our focus than other state churches do. We provide coaching, an ear, guidance. But when it comes time to making decisions on what's best for First Church of God Vincennes, your pastor and your board are going to figure that out. It's their job, and it's not our job to tell them what to do. We can respond, we can give our opinion, but the buck stops with your new pastor, and you're going to have a new board. You're going to have what, Keith, 5 new people? Come on? 4 to 5. Keith says, fresh meat. Yeah. But, you've got that, and you've got some great board members, and I know you're going to fill, and some of those might be re-ups or something like that. When you got a good leader, you don't want to use them, but there's going to be some people like Keith and others that are timing out, so you'll have some fresh faces on there. But we're not going to dictate. We're not going to be a dictator. We're a true friend and a partner. And I just think we just go further together. So, all right, John, you ready? All right. Part of my strategy was to talk and talk and talk, and where somebody says, I just want out. But if you have any questions, we're going to stay as long as you got questions. So that's important. Anybody have any questions you want to bring up, talk about? Or any comments or things you want me to clarify where I might have muddied the water on a really well-worded question you just heard, and you say, I don't think he really answered it.
What happens if the pastor goes against a vote of the congregation?
Pastor goes against the vote of the like the pastor's voted in, and he or she.
No. The pastor is here, and he decides to do something or wants to do something, and the congregation votes against it, and he goes ahead and does it.
Well, according to your bylaws, those decisions would be limited to approving money of a certain amount, a loan of a certain amount, approving a budget, approving sale of property or acquisition of property, approving a staff member. If the pastor would go against any of those things, that would be a very serious matter between the pastor and the board that would need to be addressed.
What we had happen was when they decided to have 2 services, the congregation voted against it. And the pastor said it was going to be on him, and he was going to go ahead and do it, and he did it.
Yeah. Well, that's really an example of what we were talking about in the covenant, that the congregation is used to operating like a family, where the family gets together and they make a decision, and we're all in this together. And so we're going to go to one or two services. Well, let's have a vote. Let's hash it out. Let's tell the reasons. And that works for churches that are smaller. But for this church that's currently about 220, 200, 250, depending on weather and COVID and all that stuff, that just doesn't work. So what we're trying to get you to do in the covenant is transition to a place where the pastor, now if I'm pastor under governance, here's what I would do. If I really thought we'd have to go to two services, I would keep my ear to the ground, and I'd be having conversations with key people. I talk to my board and say, hey, I've got this idea. My staff has talked it over. Here's some of the challenges, like maybe children's church might be a challenge, or Sunday school, what would happen because we're used to the routine on Sunday. Talk to my Sunday school teachers, the Board of Christian Ed, or whatever it is, and just get their feedback. We're thinking about this. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And then if I really think that the mission of the church would be enhanced by going to two services, you wouldn't have congregational votes, because this church is just too big to hash all that stuff out in a business meeting. So you'd have to trust your board and the pastor that when that decision is made, and the board would say, Pastor, you got the freedom to do this even without asking us, but you're kind of a little bit, stubborn if you don't. I would absolutely inform my board of what I was thinking and hear their feedback, but they'd look at the guiding principles. Is this violating any of the guiding principles? Is he doing this appropriately? Is he keeping us informed? Well, okay. And Pastor, you've had all the discussion. There's positives and negatives. We can see what you're saying. What are you going to do? And Pastor would say, like Pastor George did, this is on me. I'm going to go ahead and pull the trigger on it and do it. And that's what you're going to have to get away from, because when everybody in the church thinks, and a lot of times when we do consultations, we'll hear, well, we just need more communication. We need more communication. Well, talk to me. What's that mean? And what it means is we really want to operate as a church of 50 people to 100 people where everybody can get together and approve everything dollar spent. We can all agree on when VBS is going to happen, and it just doesn't work. And maybe I even illustrated, there's a little Church of God out in the country surrounded by soybean fields in Francisco, Gentle Shepherd Church of God. That's a church plant of all things, but they're about 60 to 70 people. They meet every month, and they have a meeting every month to decide, here's how much money we got in the bank, here's what we spent on this month, here's what we're looking to spend on next month. They got a board, but the board loves to get everybody together and hear everybody's, and you know what? It works for them. They got the most beautiful country. If you ever want to have a country wedding or a country event, go there. Like I said, I'm kind of blind to decorations and stuff, but I can't be blind over there. I'm at every fixture, every pew. Either it's historic in its meaning or it is just the best of the best. They have it. Everything from the basement on up. It's gorgeous. They built a brand new fellowship hall. Beautiful. They bought extra ground. Beautiful. And you know what? They don't owe a penny. They've paid cash for everything. But it works for them. But as you get so large, it just starts to break down. And we talked about that in a life cycle, that this church, I was surprised with your current structure that you were tipping up to 500 at one time. I don't know how you did it. But I think you shed a lot of blood and tears in some meetings, and it wasn't pleasant, but you did it. But then what happens is you tend to come back to the organizational size that you're geared for, and you're not geared to be a church of 250. You're really not. You're geared to be a church more in the 100, 150 range. So that's it. It's probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but
The thing of it was, and it was said in the meeting, that you were going to end up with two congregations. And that's when we started going down.
well, I don't know if that would be, it might be a correlation, but I don't know if it was a causal thing, like it caused it. It timed out the same correlation. But here's the thing, and you got to know this, and even in this church, you don't know everybody, do you? I don't think there's one person, there might be just a few, but there are people here you don't know. Unless you're like Doug's wife, Cindy. She knows oodles of people personally. But, studies have shown, you know about, now when I mean know, you know their name, you know what they do, you know a little bit about them. You can say hi to them on a first-name basis, no matter where you are. About 75 to 100 people, max. That's it. That's all you'll know. So whether you're in a church of 175 or in a church of 17,000, you're going to know about that many. That's what we're wired to relationally by God, to be able to know as friends. So, the idea that if we grow to 2 services, or, in Pennsylvania, I had a lay leader say, I don't want my church to grow. I want to know everybody. And that's a common thing that you hear. But the thing is, nobody's going to be limiting you on the number of friends and relationships you can have as you grow. And remember, we get together, yes, we're on a mission. Remember the battleship and cruise ship thing I talked about in the life cycle? It just helps us to remember we're on a mission. You're going to know your crew. You're going to know your 75 to 100 people, and you're going to have that circle of friends. But as the church grows, you're not going to lose friends. You're going to keep that amount of friends. And here's what I tell people that are persnickety like me. You could swap out your old friends that don't cut it for new friends that are even better. So as you grow, you got more choice. You're not stuck with people. I say that tongue-in-cheek, but a little bit in reality, too. Okay, any more? John's there. Anybody have any more questions? Going once? Twice? Oh, we got one back there, and then maybe one up here.
I just know there's been a lot that's went into all of this, and I just want to say thank you.
I'll just maybe make an observation. I'm not going to say this representing the board, but as my observation as being a board member, we wrestled with a lot of these questions and did spend a lot of time thinking about them and processing them, and hashing them out, and concerns, and we didn't like a lot of the things, some of us, but then some of them came down to, we were either already doing this, or our congregation has done it in the past, or, like the 5% to Indiana Ministries. We've historically in the past given 10% to Church of God. So that, to me, that became like a non-issue. The conditional deeding thing, we had a concern about. And I think we found we've been conditionally deeded since like the 50s or something to Indiana Ministries.
Yeah, the church voted, it's in your bylaws.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
To conditionally deed. Yep.
Yeah, so people long before us already decided a lot of this stuff. People that put a lot of time and effort into it already did this stuff beforehand. And like we were talking in the board meeting, the whole, kind of governance of the church and everything. We are the only organization that likes to micromanage everything. hospitals, universities, businesses, they have a CEO that reports to the board and does what's best for the organization. But it seems like we as the church always want to, kind of, like I said, micromanage, whatever, nitpick, and instead of just letting them do their job and doing what, we'll say what we're paying them to do. I don't, for lack of a better term, but we kind of get in this rut that we need to voice our opinion on every little thing. And honestly, I want to, when I'm a member here, I want to know we have somebody up there that has spent the time taking care of what he or she needs to take care of. And I don't need to worry about the little things of, what they put into it to get it right. And just as a board member, we kind of wrestled with those things, processed them, and I'm excited about what we're going to do, should we do this. I am looking forward to it, and being part of something that is going to take us into the future. And are these changes going to happen tomorrow? No. But we're putting them in place for generations to come. Just like, this church has a history of 100+ years. And people 100 years ago did things thinking of, they probably didn't think of us now, but they did for future generations. And we need to be doing this for people that will be sitting here 3, 5, 20 years down the road. I'm excited about it.
Nobody? All right. Can I pray us out? All right. Father, I thank you for people giving up their Sunday afternoon to come here. Thank you, Father, for the folks that took time to read through line by line this covenant agreement. And Father, we just know that you've got this church. You do. It belongs to you. It bears your mission. It has made a difference throughout, as Matt was saying, over 100 years. And Father, I'm just so thankful for what the church is wrestling with now. Father, we ask your guidance. We ask your Holy Spirit to go ahead of us towards next week. I'll be here next week. And I just look forward to seeing the church to make a decision. Thank you, Father, for the questions. Thank you for the patience of the people to put up with me as I answered maybe just a little bit too long on each of them. But I'd rather give them a little bit too much than be vague and nondescript in my answers and short. We thank you. I thank you, and I just want to hear you just hear me just praise the people that are here and gave their time and attention. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, John.